Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The person my family kept pointing at as the disappointment, the one they thought would never achieve anything, was the one quietly carrying weight they never even acknowledged, and the one who walked into Christmas dinner with more control than any of them could have imagined. The night started the way it always did, with everyone crowding around the table pretending everything was perfect, my mom glowing as if this was her yearly performance review, and my brother Ethan sitting there with that smug half-smile that only he can pull off when he knows he is about to be praised. She raised her glass, tapped it against her plate for attention, and announced like she was delivering breaking news that Ethan had just been promoted at work, that the company finally recognized his brilliance, and then, as if she had been waiting all year to do it, she turned toward me and asked, "So, Lauren, when will you do something with your life?" She said it with that tone that isn't really a question. It's more like a dagger wrapped in fake curiosity, and the room went quiet the way it always does when she puts me on the spot. I should have felt embarrassed, or at least defensive, because that is how she trained me to feel since I was a kid, but instead I felt something else, calm, steady, like I had been rehearsing for this moment for years without even realizing it. I looked at her, I looked at Ethan. I even glanced at my dad, who was already shrinking back into his chair because he hates confrontation, and I said, "Oh, I already did. I just didn't tell anyone who never believed in me." The smile slid off her face like someone cut the power. Ethan laughed nervously and reached for the gravy boat as if that would reset the tension, but Dad froze, and for once it was my mom who didn't know what to say next. The truth is, I had spent years playing the quiet helper in this family. When Ethan was struggling in college, who paid for his tutoring sessions as a loan that he conveniently forgot about? Me. When Dad's contracting jobs slowed down and they needed help with bills, who covered the electric one month and the grocery tab the next? Me. When Mom wanted to throw that big anniversary party, but the caterer demanded a deposit she didn't have, who slid her a check she swore she would pay back? Me again. And yet, none of that ever counted as achievement. To them, it was invisible, because in their world achievement only exists when it can be bragged about in public. My work, my money, my support, none of it ever qualified as something worth raising a glass over. I realized a long time ago that explaining myself to them was pointless. Every time I tried, they would twist it, dismiss it, or compare it to Ethan's supposedly bigger accomplishments. So I stopped explaining. I learned to keep my moves private, to let silence be my protection, to build in the background while they all thought I was standing still. I started saving receipts, literal ones and the kind you keep in your inbox. I filed things away. I formed an LLC under a name that wasn't immediately connected to me. I made choices that nobody at that table even suspected. And that night, I decided it was time to stop hiding, not by arguing with them, not by shouting or defending myself, but by letting proof speak louder than words. So I reached into my bag, pulled out a sealed envelope, and slid it across the table toward my dad. Everyone stared at it like it might explode. My mom asked what it was with that edge in her voice, and I just said, "If you really want to know what I've done with my life, it's in there. You can read it, or you can keep pretending. Your choice." Dad hesitated, but of course curiosity got the better of him. He opened it slowly, pulled out the single page inside, and as his eyes moved across the lines his expression changed in a way I had never seen before, not angry, not proud, not disappointed, just stunned. My mom leaned over, trying to read it upside down. Ethan craned his neck, and the silence at that table felt heavier than anything I had experienced in that house. What was inside wasn't a bill. It wasn't a desperate plea for validation. It wasn't even a resume. It was a letter from my attorney, Amrita Patel, addressed to Ethan's company, laying out a timeline of intellectual property, work I had created, notes and prototypes that had been used without my consent, and a formal notice that by Monday, the company's legal counsel would need to respond. My dad looked up at me, his mouth slightly open like he wanted to ask 100 questions, but couldn't decide where to start. My mom's voice, sharp and cracking, broke the silence with, "Lauren, what is this?" And Ethan, for once in his life, didn't have a single smug comeback. I took a sip of water, looked at each of them, and said, "It will make sense by Monday. Until then, maybe stop assuming I'm the one who hasn't done anything with her life." And with that, the dinner continued, but the air had shifted completely. Every bite of food was forced, every laugh sounded hollow, and the envelope sat there like a live wire nobody dared to touch again. They wanted to believe I was bluffing, that it was some elaborate stunt, but deep down they knew I had finally stopped playing small. That night ended not with applause for Ethan, not with my mom's usual victory lap about her golden child, but with the entire family wondering what exactly I had just put in motion and what Monday was going to bring. And let me tell you, Monday changed everything. If you want to understand why I walked into that dinner with a sealed envelope instead of another apology, you have to go back to the string of favors that were never favors. The ones that started as family help and somehow turned into free labor that other people could brag about, because a few years ago Ethan called me on a Sunday night and said he was stuck on a workflow problem that his team kept punting from sprint to sprint. And he asked if I could give him quick notes, nothing formal. Just sister to brother, and because I still believed back then that helping him would be seen for what it was, I shared an outline, a checklist, and a rough prototype that I had built for a small client who never fully implemented it. And I emailed it to him with a friendly line that said, "This is a starting point, not a deliverable. Please keep it internal and let me know what your team needs licensed if they want to take it further." What happened next is the part that taught me how fast a story can erase a source, because within a month he was presenting a trimmed version of my outline at a leadership huddle, calling it an initiative he had been incubating. And by the end of that quarter, the process had been wrapped into a series of internal decks with his name on the title slide, which I only found out about because a mutual acquaintance who knew my writing style sent me a photo and said, "This looks familiar," and when I confronted Ethan gently, he brushed it off with a casual, "It's all in the family. Lauren, you are making this weird. The company owns whatever we touch here anyway," which was not only insulting, but also legally sloppy. So I took a deep breath and decided that arguing would be a waste while documentation would be a weapon that never raises its voice. I started building quiet fences that do not look like fences until someone tries to climb over them, which meant I cleaned up my original repository, pushed it into a private remote with timestamped commits, paid for a third-party hash verification just because I like to future-proof, and then, after a quick consult with Amrita, I filed a narrow provisional around the specific orchestration flow that I had created and linked it to a limited license framework inside my small LLC, which I had registered under a name that does not scream heart, and after that I submitted a vendor registration with Ethan's employer that did not obligate me to anything but established a paper link between my company and theirs, so that if my material ever appeared in their environment without a license, someone in compliance would raise an eyebrow before I had to raise my voice. Do not get me wrong, I was not hunting a payday or sitting around plotting to embarrass my brother. I was simply done being the person who gives and then watches credit float downstream to whoever is louder. And I decided that if the day ever came when I needed to pull a thread and show a trail, I would be able to do it in a way that even a hostile audience would have to respect. And when Ethan's promotion email landed with language that matched my phrasing almost word for word, the kind of phrasing you only write once and remember forever, I realized the day had arrived. That is why the letter in the envelope was not a threat, not a lawsuit, not even a demand. It was a professional notice with dates, repository hashes, email headers, and a straightforward offer that any reasonable company could accept without theatrics. And it asked for 3 things that would set the story straight without trashing anyone's career: a limited license fee paid to my LLC that acknowledged use of my process, a written correction inside their knowledge base that attributed authorship properly, and an internal ethics note to protect anyone in the future who speaks up when attribution goes sideways, because I am not the only person who has been told to be quiet for the sake of family harmony or team spirit. I knew the moment that letter hit their system because the autoresponder from corporate counsel pinged my inbox, and then, faster than I expected. The autoresponder was overridden by a direct reply from a man named Mark Lawson who did not waste words and did not posture. He simply asked for a call that same week to understand scope and risk. And while I waited for the calendar invite, I watched my family group thread light up with a familiar routine, my mother insisting that I was overreacting, Ethan insisting that I was misremembering, and my father asking if this could please wait until after the holidays because stress is bad for his blood pressure. And I answered none of them beyond a single line that said I am telling the truth and the documents will speak for themselves, because I have learned that when you finally have leverage, you do not spend it trying to win small arguments in text bubbles. By the time I finished making tea and sitting down to breathe, the meeting invite arrived with a subject line that did not try to spin or soften anything, because sometimes the real story is so clean it does not need decoration, and there it was on my screen. Crisp and undeniable, internal review, immediate, and I knew the ground under Ethan's promotion had just begun to move. When the invite for the internal review landed in my inbox, I knew that the years I had spent quietly documenting, saving, and preparing had finally moved from being my private safety net to becoming the undeniable evidence that would now define Ethan's future. Because the moment counsel asked for a meeting marked the exact second when his shiny new promotion stopped being a family bragging point and started being a liability his company would have to explain. I walked into that call with Amrita at my side, calm and prepared, not because I enjoy confrontation, but because for once the playing field had tilted in my direction. And I was not about to waste the chance by losing my composure or softening the truth for the sake of his reputation. The conversation itself was not dramatic in the way movies make you think these things are. There was no shouting, no table pounding, no sudden outburst of emotion, just a careful, almost clinical exchange where Amrita laid out the timeline, the repositories, the email trail, and the provisional filing, and I explained in clear terms what had been shared as a personal favor and what had later been paraded as Ethan's independent initiative. I emphasized that this was not about humiliating anyone publicly or tearing down the company's credibility. It was about correcting a record that had been distorted, compensating fairly for the work that had been used, and putting safeguards in place so that the next person who raised a concern would not be dismissed simply because their voice was smaller or their last name lacked influence. The company's counsel listened carefully, and when I finished, he leaned forward, rubbed his forehead, and admitted that the phrasing in Ethan's recent promotion materials matched my original draft so closely that it was almost impossible to argue coincidence. And while he never said outright that Ethan had crossed a line, the pause in his speech and the careful way he asked about potential settlement terms told me everything I needed to know. They were already calculating how much it would cost them to fix this without dragging it into discovery or letting shareholders sniff out an attribution scandal. I kept my face neutral, but inside I felt a sharp, steady vindication, not a loud, triumphant kind of victory, but the quiet realization that for once my voice was not being brushed aside. While that call was unfolding, my mother had decided to launch her own counterattack in the family group chat, because nothing fuels her like the chance to defend her golden child, and she wrote paragraph after paragraph accusing me of being jealous, ungrateful, and destructive, claiming that families are supposed to support each other instead of tearing each other down, and insisting that by involving lawyers I had crossed a line that no decent daughter should cross. I could almost hear her voice as I read the texts, sharp, indignant, desperate to paint me as the villain, and for the first time in my life I did not feel the need to respond with long explanations or emotional pleas. I simply typed one sentence: "You raised me not to lie, and I am not lying." Then I put my phone face down on the table and returned to the meeting, because the truth is that when you finally learn to stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you regain hours of your life you never realized you had lost. After the call ended, Amrita and I outlined next steps: formal licensing negotiations, draft language for attribution, and a written ethics note that would protect internal whistleblowers. She assured me that these were reasonable requests and that any competent counsel would see it was cheaper to settle cleanly than to drag their feet. As I walked out of her office into the crisp air, I knew that the price of my silence all those years had finally become visible in dollars, reputations, and stalled bonuses. Because that same evening Ethan's manager informed him that his performance bonus was being put on hold until the review was completed, and the smug smile I had seen at Christmas dinner would not be making another appearance anytime soon. Of course, Ethan tried to call me almost immediately, his name flashing on my phone again and again as if sheer persistence could undo documentation, but I let each call ring out until voicemail picked it up. Because I had no interest in being drawn back into emotional negotiations where he could manipulate me into feeling guilty. Instead, I sent him a single text that said, "Talk to counsel, I am done being your unpaid idea farm," and then I turned the phone off, because that boundary had to be absolute. Meanwhile, my father, who has always hated conflict, called me privately and asked if there was any way to resolve this quietly without Ethan losing face, and for once I did not cushion the reality for him either. I told him plainly that the time for quiet resolutions had passed the moment Ethan presented my work as his own, that the documents spoke louder than any excuses, and that the only thing left to decide was whether my family wanted to keep pretending I was the disappointment or whether they were finally ready to accept that I had been the only one acting like an adult. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without replaying conversations in my head, without trying to guess how I could have explained myself better, without feeling the need to justify my existence to people who had already written their version of the story. The price of my silence had been high, but the reward for finally breaking it was higher. Ethan's career momentum stalled, my voice acknowledged by a system that usually erases people like me, and a line drawn so clearly that even my mother's furious texts could not blur it. And as I drifted off, I realized that this was only the beginning, because internal reviews rarely stop at a single meeting, and the next round would force choices that no amount of family loyalty could shield Ethan from. Choices that would show just how much of his success was borrowed and how much was truly his. When the email confirming mediation arrived, I felt a calmness that surprised even me, because instead of dread or anxiety, I carried a quiet certainty that the months of documenting every exchange, filing every timestamp, and registering every necessary form had brought me to a moment where nothing depended on performance or charm, only on facts lined up in such a way that even the most stubborn narrative could not stand against them. And I knew that for once Ethan's career would not be measured by how loudly he spoke or how much our mother bragged, but by how carefully the truth had been preserved behind the scenes. The mediation was scheduled for early January, a time when most people still pretended to be on holiday mode, but inside the glass walls of that downtown office the mood was stripped of festivity, and I walked in with Amrita beside me, steady as ever, while Ethan avoided my eyes and our mother clung to her phone in the lobby as though some desperate text could still reset the story. The company's counsel, Mark Lawson, was the kind of professional who wasted no words and revealed nothing in his expression. But I could see in the way he had organized his notes and in the precise questions he asked that he was less interested in protecting Ethan personally than in shielding the company from reputational fallout. And that was the leverage I had prepared for all along, because while a brother might dodge accountability by leaning on family dynamics, a corporation cannot afford to ignore verifiable intellectual property trails without risking lawsuits, shareholder questions, and compliance audits. Amrita began by laying out the sequence in meticulous order. From the original draft I had emailed with language clearly marked as exploratory, to the private repository commits that bore my name and date stamps, to the provisional filing lodged under my LLC with legal proof of origination, and finally to the vendor registration that placed my company in their system long before Ethan's team integrated the workflow into their so-called innovation deck. I added context without emotion, explaining how I had shared the material as a personal favor, how I had trusted that family would not abuse that trust, and how I had remained silent when Ethan first presented it, but had chosen to act only when my own words resurfaced in a corporate promotion announcement, because at that point silence was no longer humility, it was complicity, and I refused to keep subsidizing someone else's rise by erasing myself. Lawson listened carefully, occasionally pressing Ethan to respond, but Ethan's answers were defensive and thin, the kind of vague claims that collapse under dates and timestamps. And with every faltering explanation, his credibility shrank not just in front of me, but in front of the very people who had once celebrated him as a rising star. When the discussion turned to settlement terms, Amrita was firm but not aggressive, presenting our conditions with the same clarity as a grocery list: a fair licensing fee paid directly to my LLC in acknowledgement of use, a written correction in the company's internal knowledge base attributing authorship accurately, and a public but internal ethics memo establishing procedures for protecting individuals who raise attribution concerns. I added one more requirement that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with legacy: a donation to establish a scholarship fund in our grandmother's name at the community college where she had studied decades ago. A place that had trained countless technicians who kept the company's infrastructure alive, yet had never been recognized by the executives who preferred to glorify innovation while ignoring the workers who sustained it. Lawson tried at first to minimize the scholarship piece, suggesting it might be handled privately or later, but I insisted that it be written into the agreement as a visible sign that this correction was not just transactional but restorative. And after a moment of silence he nodded, perhaps realizing that the optics of refusing such a modest but symbolic gesture would be worse than conceding it. Ethan glared at me across the table, but I met his stare without flinching, because this was not about humiliation, it was about accountability, and he was finally realizing that I was not bluffing. By the time the draft agreement was read aloud, the air in the room had shifted from tense resistance to reluctant acceptance. The language stated that the workflow would henceforth be cited as the Hart Patel process, acknowledging both my authorship and the legal partnership through Amrita's filings, and that Ethan would be reassigned away from the program he had once used as his springboard, effectively stripping his promotion of the very foundation on which it had been built. The company agreed to pay the licensing fee, issue the internal correction, circulate the ethics memo, and make the scholarship donation, all within 30 days, and I signed without hesitation, not because I needed the money or the recognition, but because this was the only way to ensure that the years of being ignored, minimized, and dismissed were not the final version of my story. When I left the building, I texted my father with a simple line: "There is a second envelope for you," and I meant it literally, because inside my bag was another sealed document, this one not addressed to a corporation but to my parents, laying out in plain language the boundaries I was establishing with them from that day forward. It was not vindictive, it was not cruel, it was simply a declaration that financial support, emotional labor, and constant patience would no longer be taken for granted, and that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to start with respect instead of ridicule. As the winter sun set on the city that evening, I felt no need to celebrate loudly or gloat over my brother's stumble, because what mattered most was not the corporate concession or even the scholarship fund, but the fact that for the first time in my adult life, I had acted without apology, and the consequences now rested on the people who had always believed they were untouchable. And though Ethan still had his title on paper, everyone in that room knew that the foundation beneath it had cracked, and that the sister he once called a disappointment had become the one person he could no longer dismiss. When the mediation ended and the agreement was signed, I walked out of that office carrying not only the papers that proved the company had accepted responsibility, but also a clarity about my family that had been building for years. And I knew that if I simply returned to silence, if I allowed them to spin their version of the story again, all of this would dissolve into another chapter where I was cast as bitter, difficult, or envious. So I prepared something more permanent, something they could not dismiss with raised voices or selective memory. That was the second envelope I had mentioned to my father, the one not addressed to lawyers or executives, but to my own parents, a letter that laid out boundaries in language as firm and undeniable as the legal settlement I had just secured. In that letter I explained, without anger, but with absolute precision, that I would no longer provide financial help under the table, no more covering utility bills when they were short, no more slipping Ethan grocery money disguised as gifts, no more loans that were never acknowledged, and no more emotional labor spent absorbing insults disguised as jokes. Instead, I established a small trust, managed by a third party, earmarked strictly for health or emergency expenses, so that if true hardship struck, they would not be left with nothing, but it would be transparent, structured, and outside the cycle of manipulation that had drained me for years. I wrote that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to start with respect, not comparisons, not public humiliations, not the endless pedestal for Ethan while I was treated as a cautionary tale. It was not a threat, it was a contract of dignity. When my father opened that envelope a week later, he called me privately and his voice was softer than I had heard in years. He admitted he had underestimated the weight I had been carrying, admitted that he had known in the back of his mind that I was contributing more than anyone wanted to say out loud, and admitted that the evidence in those legal documents had forced him to see what words alone had never convinced him of. He did not apologize for all the years of silence, but his tone carried something close to remorse, and for the first time I felt that he had begun to understand that neutrality is not harmless when one child is constantly diminished to elevate another. Ethan, on the other hand, could not handle the humiliation of losing ground, and his attempt at an apology came in the form of a phone call laced with excuses, where he insisted that he had never meant to steal, that he had simply expanded on my work, that everyone borrows ideas, and that I had overreacted by involving lawyers. He even said, "You know how Mom is, she just wanted something to brag about," as if his own actions had been powerless against her constant need for stories. I listened long enough to confirm that he was incapable of genuine accountability, and when he tried to pivot into asking if we could settle it between siblings now that the company had conceded, I cut him off and told him that there would be no private rewriting of history, that he had been caught because I had receipts, and that the only path forward was through the official channels already established. His sigh on the other end of the line told me he finally realized I was no longer the sister who could be guilted into silence. My mother never called, never texted, never sent even a half-hearted explanation. She stayed quiet, which was in its own way more revealing than any speech, because silence had always been her weapon against me, and now that silence turned against her, leaving her without the ability to reframe the story in her usual dramatic tones. Perhaps one day she will find words, perhaps not, but I have reached a point where her approval no longer sits on the list of things I am waiting for. Meanwhile, the company issued its internal communication, reclassifying the initiative as the Hart Patel process, with proper attribution listed, and attached to the memo was the new ethics policy designed to protect employees who speak up. Ethan was reassigned to a different team, his bonus formally withheld, and though he still technically held his title, the power of his promotion had been gutted, because everyone in that building knew now that the foundation of his innovation was not his own. At the same time, the scholarship fund in our grandmother's name was announced, modest in size but deeply symbolic, a reminder that legacies are built not by the loudest brags, but by the people who put in the work and preserve it with integrity. When I think back to that Christmas dinner, to the moment my mother asked when I would finally do something with my life, I can only shake my head at the irony, because the truth was that I had already done more than they ever realized. I had built structures, protected ideas, created stability, and learned to wield silence as strategy rather than submission, and by the time I revealed any of it, the groundwork was so solid that their disbelief no longer mattered. The dinner that began with Ethan's promotion ended with a family forced to confront the fact that their so-called disappointment had outmaneuvered them all, and while that might sound harsh, it was not about revenge for me. It was about finally reclaiming the terms of respect. I ended my letter with one final line, not dramatic, not bitter, just steady. "I stopped performing small so you could feel big, and I will never do that again." And whether or not they ever accept it, whether or not they ever apologize, whether or not Ethan ever grows enough to see the full weight of what he did, I am fine, because I have chosen a different path, one where respect is not begged for but required. And one where the story of my life is not written at someone else's table, but in my own steady hand.